playing Sekiro pretty consistently since it came out a few weeks ago, but I've also not been dedicating all my time to it like I expected. Usually when I buy a game, especially one I've been looking forward to, I go whole hog into it, and it's all I do for a few days until I've finished everything I can out of it, and then I'll play it in bits and pieces here and there, and maybe do it while I do other things, but after a while, I'm never going to hit the same intensity I did in my first run. That has not happened with Sekiro, and instead I've experienced a lot more of a slow burn with it. I've played it for a few hours every day, and then a few hours every other day, and while I'm very close to the end now, and I've enjoyed all of it, it's been a very different experience for me, and it's really allowed me to soak the game in, and really appreciate a lot of what it does, because of the slower pace I've been taking with it. I've cut the rest of my free time with watching Kamen Rider, which is a show that I've just really started to get into and am really falling in love with. I played the Bloody Palace DLC for Devil May Cry 5, and then I just had other things that I've been doing in my life. So even though I have not finished Sekiro, I do feel like I've dedicated enough time to it that I can speak a little more definitively about the discussion that's been surrounding it lately. This discussion is on whether or not Sekiro needs an easy mode. This discussion happens every time a particularly difficult game receives a lot of critical acclaim, and it always feels like a salty journalist who is upset that they have a deadline to meet and they hit a really difficult part of a game, but they cannot step away from it and sort of let it simmer and sit like I can. They have to finish it by a certain amount of time, and that prompts frustration, and it prompts think pieces about how, like, well, this game should be easier, or it should offer an easy alternative for things, because that's what I want. And the response to that is often, that's not what people who like these games want, and that's not what the creators intended. That's not the artistic vision of the game. This discussion has played out numerous times over the last few years, and I never find it particularly engaging or interesting. It's just one of those talking points that never goes away and never gets resolved. However, this most recent run of it has had this insidious edge to it, wherein which people imply that an easy mode would open up accessibility to gamers with disabilities. I think that's nonsense, because an easy mode doesn't open up the accessibility at all. All it does is condescend to those who have to use an easy mode and offer a subpar experience. Now, before I discuss why that is, we have to break down exactly what the combat in Sekiro is. Sekiro is not about spacing like its predecessors were. Bloodborne and Dark Souls are all about finding a spot around the boss where you can wail on them, but they can't really hit you very well. Sekiro, if anything, is a game best played stationary, without touching the left analog stick at all. Instead, what you should do is fan L1, the block button, because if you block an attack the moment it connects, you parry that attack. And a parried attack doesn't just negate damage, it also deals damage. It deals a very specific type of damage to the enemy called posture damage. Sekiro is a game based entirely around finishing moves, and when you fill up an enemy's posture bar through doing posture damage, you can then instantly do a death blow no matter what their health is at. Now, the lower the health, the more posture damage they take, and the slower their posture damage regenerates. So you do want to still actually do normal everyday damage. But there's a really interesting rock, paper, scissors sort of thing there of, is this boss weak to posture? Because they do a lot of rapid attacks and it's very easy to build up posture damage. Or do they rely on single strong strikes that might be difficult to parry, or you can't parry at all? So you really have to focus in on hitting them when you can. Or maybe it's a mixture of both, and finding that mixture is really gratifying and really interesting. It especially gets great later in the game, because then it's not how does this boss react to these, it's how does this individual move react. Is this a move I should dodge? Is this a move I should block? Or is this a move I can parry? Or is this just one that I have to just completely avoid? That ebb and flow is very interesting and very satisfying. I think Sekiro has the highest skill ceiling of any Souls-like game, but more than that, I think Sekiro demands you to play higher. I think Sekiro demands you to play closer to that skill ceiling than any other Souls game. You can play Dark Souls and Bloodborne to completion and not come anywhere near fully appreciating all the mechanics that the combat has to offer. Not so with Sekiro. You really have to use every tool at your disposal just to eke by. Now, there are downsides to that. Specifically, I think there's a lot of bosses that require near perfect play. Their damage output is so crazy high that 1 or 2 hits will kill you. So you have to really be perfect in parrying and dodging, and that's not always easy. But your attacks don't really do a whole lot of damage back to them, and that's frustrating, and I don't necessarily love that sort of endurance element to some of those fights. I'd much rather that be based more around mastering the parrying of them and getting them weak, or maybe using the parries to open up gaps in their defenses and then hitting them that way. I don't care for that, and while I haven't finished the game, I find the most troubling bosses deal a ton of damage and don't really have many openings, and it's not super fun. But that's a criticism I have for the game in general. I don't want an easy mode to fix that. I would want FromSoft to actually go in and alter how those bosses work so that you get more reward from that risk. I don't think that's the same as wanting an easy mode. And more importantly, I have to question, what is it about that system that keeps disabled players from playing the game to its fullest? And what part of that system would an easy mode fix? Sekiro is all about reflex. Like I said, spacing's not super important. The puzzle aspects that you would find occasionally in other Souls games isn't nearly as present here. It's all about parrying and hitting. The problem is that system is so fine-tuned that altering anything in it fundamentally changes the game, and I think for the worse. Sekiro is built entirely around its combat. The exploration and sort of dissident narrative elements of other Souls games are a lot more muted here. The narrative here is more typical. It's still interesting, but it's not anything as mysterious as it is in the other games, and I don't quite get the same sense of exploration I get in the other titles, because it's all focused on actually fighting. That's where the game shines. To change that in any fundamental way would completely change the appeal of the game. So on the one hand, I don't think there's nearly as much here for someone not interested in the combat to even get out of it, which kind of makes an easy mode pointless. Let's say someone wants to do the combat, and they just need the easy mode to give them a little more leeway. Well, what is an easy mode? 9 times out of 10, an easy mode is just a change in damage values. You do a little more damage, and you can take a few more hits. Your defense is a little higher. Now, I said before, I think in many cases, Sekiro should do that uniformly. I think that is how the game should play. Closer to an open world Bushido blade. And sometimes it almost is that. When you're fighting mobs, it can feel very much like a Bushido blade game, and that's where the game really shines for me, but bosses are not quite that. But fundamentally, the punishing difficulty is not going to keep someone who's disabled from playing the game and liking it. All an easy mode's really going to do is maybe give you a little more leeway. It might make it so that an attack that otherwise would have killed you didn't, or an attack that maybe would have come up short finishes them off. That might help, but fundamentally, the thing that would keep someone from playing Sekiro at all is how reflex intensive it is. I don't think there's really anything about it in terms of difficulty that keeps disabled players from getting full enjoyment out of it. The problem is that if you can't physically perform these actions, these reflex actions, the game's impossible. But also, the reflex actions can't really be altered at all. It's pretty forgiving in terms of parry, and it's all about reading what an enemy attack is going to do and memorizing it. But I don't think there's a way to actually make that any easier. The only way I can imagine that is by completely removing some moves that are hard to read, or are very last second reads you have to do, but then that's a fundamentally worse experience. That's a fundamentally different one. Now you're not playing Sekiro on easy mode, now you're playing Diet Sekiro. Now you're playing a half-baked version of Sekiro, an incomplete version. But if the whole point of adding easy modes to these games is to allow disabled players to play them, you don't want a half-baked version. What you want is a version that's just as good as the original one, just maybe with a different control scheme that's more conducive to how you play games, which Sekiro does. You can completely remap all the controls on the controller to whatever you want. That's an accessibility option, and it's one that, yes, they should have done in other games, but is here, and it's one we don't really talk about very much. That is From Software adding in accessibility options. But more importantly, who is it exactly that's not allowed to play Sekiro as it is now? Is it people without hands? Because I don't know if an easy mode's gonna fix that. However, I do know there's a whole sort of subgenre of Twitch streamers who are disabled and are able to play games through alternate methods and do fairly well at them. Even able-bodied people will do this just to do it. I've seen people finish Yoshi's Island with a DDR pad, or run through a Destiny raid with a Guitar Hero drum kit. And yeah, you need hands for that last one, but not for the first one. But what if you have a neurological problem? What if you just can't physically perform those reflexes? Well, there's really no way around that. I suppose you could actually go in and cheat Sekiro in such a way that enemies don't actually attack you, and it would just sort of be this weird walking simulator exploration thing, which sounds kind of cool. It would be cool for FromSoft to offer that, like, as an actual option, and something console players could do too. I'd certainly be interested in checking that out. But again, that's not Sekiro. That's a totally different experience. If you have a neurological issue where your reflexes are slowed, or you just can't perform those actions, there's no easy mode in the world that's going to let you experience Sekiro. Just weird altered versions of it. A vanilla Sekiro, or a cherry Sekiro. Maybe that's good and maybe that's enjoyable, but that's not the same as what Sekiro is. As mean as it sounds to say out loud, there's just some things that you can't do if you have certain disabilities. And unfortunately, playing games like Sekiro is kind of in that ballpark. But I also don't think there's all that many people who can't find ways around their disabilities. There's one dude who, as sort of proof that Sekiro doesn't need an easy mode, beat one of the very hard in-game bosses despite having paraplegia, which is a very bad neurological disorder. I believe it's an injury in your neck. So everything from the neck down is shot. And I didn't intend this when I recorded all this footage. This was just where I was at in the game, and I took an honest attempt at fighting this boss and just got wrecked the whole time. But this boss that I've been having my shit kicked in by the whole time is the same boss he beat, which really made me feel... I actually felt pretty happy about it. It felt very very poetic, or it felt almost faded. Like, I was a little hesitant, like, maybe this topic's offhand, but when I saw that, I decided, yeah, I think I'm gonna go ahead with the video. This makes sense. And there's others. Broly Legs, a very prolific fighting game player, is very disabled. And his disabilities do extend to his arms. They're not properly formed. But he's a pretty high-ranking player, and he's one of the more prolific members of the FGC. Rocky No Hands is a dude who plays PUBG with a controller in his mouth, amazingly. And he does pretty well for himself. There's all sorts of people who are able to do the same thing. And yeah, it's a fundamentally different experience to control. But is it a fundamentally different experience when it comes to enjoyment? Does it really matter if you're pressing buttons with your feet or with your elbow? Because ultimately, you're still pressing them. Like I said, Sekiro is all about reflex. If your controller is a flat surface, does it really change the feeling of properly blocking like 12 attacks in a row? I don't think it does. And I think it's very shitty and disingenuous for game journalists to say that, you have to put an easy mode in, because otherwise that's discriminatory. Then you're spitting in the face of disabled gamers. I think that's nonsense, because disabled gamers have shown time and time again that the answer to accessibility is not software, it's hardware. Microsoft put out a sort of weird new controller built specifically for people with these sorts of disabilities. I think that's actually what the dude is using in his Sekiro video. Stuff like that is the answer to opening that up. It's not adding in easy modes or adding in these weird alt modes that completely change the game, because then you're not playing the game. You're playing something else that looks like it and is built in it, but that's not it. It's like saying, well, you can't play deathmatch, but you can play capture the flag. That's the same thing, right? And if you're a disabled gamer and you want to play Sekiro, you want to play Sekiro. You don't want to play some half-assed version of it. Do I really need to sit here and talk more shit about game journalists? I feel like enough of it is said, but I kind of just wanted to say my piece that an easy mode isn't an accessibility option. If you want to put an easy mode into your game to make it easier to learn that game, or make it easier for people interested in other aspects than combat or whatnot, feel free. But for a game as focused on one element as Sekiro, and as finely tuned as it is, an easy mode's not going to make it easier to get into, and it's pretty fucking condescending to pretend it will. Whatever. I can't fucking end these things to save my life.